You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 6th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
Ukraine needs security guarantees first and foremost. We are in danger.
Volodymyr Zelensky there as Ukraine once again takes the fight to Russia's Kursk region, with both sides preparing for the arrival of Donald Trump and his promise to end the war within days. From countries mired in conflict to one that is trying to emerge from a long one, Syria's foreign minister is on his first trip abroad, calling for an end to sanctions against his country. We'll explore its prospects for international recognition. We'll also get the latest business headlines, and finally...
And the Golden Globe goes to Fernanda Torres. I'm still here.
Our very own Brazilian Fernando Augusto Pacheco is among those celebrating the country's first Best Actress win ever at the Golden Globes. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. With just another 2 weeks to go until Donald Trump's inauguration, it appears clear that Russia and Ukraine are trying to consolidate as much territory in this ongoing conflict as possible. For Ukraine, over the past 24 hours, this has reportedly included a stepped-up incursion into Russia's own Kursk region, where it first gained a foothold back in August. Ukraine is no doubt hoping that any land it gains within Russia could in turn be traded for Russian-occupied land in Ukraine. Well, I'm joined now by Mark Galeotti, the political analyst and author of Putin's Wars from Chechnya to Ukraine. Mark, Happy New Year to you. It does feel a little like, this year is in some ways the same as last year when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. Tell us first of all about what is happening as far as you know in the Kursk region at the moment.
Yes, not much happiness for the new year there. I mean, it's a moment it's still very difficult to know, because in the early stages we are bombarded with essentially propaganda and partisan takes from both sides. What we can say is that the Ukrainians have launched a relatively serious drive towards the northeast of the area that they currently hold, looking as if they're trying to push at least as far as a town called Bolshaya Soldatskaya. And what's more, they're throwing some of their best troops into this. So it is clearly not just some minor feint or the like. What we don't know is, of course, whether this is meant to be just part of a wider offensive. There's some concerns in Russia that might be the case, or whether this is all it's going to be. That's going to play out over the next few days.
Is it a surprise to you, Mark, that this is happening at all? I mean, are we surprised that Ukraine has even managed to hold on to a region within Russia the way that it has?
Well, I mean, not really, because, I mean, they have lost about, almost half of the territory that they initially took. But the main point is Putin has not been distracted from his main goal of pushing forward the front lines in the Donbass region to the east of Ukraine. And clearly that had originally been one of the hopes of Kyiv, that this would make Putin move his relatively battle-hardened troops away from the Donbass front. And he hasn't essentially taken that bait. I mean, that said, look, yes, of course, the Russians hope to have by this point squeezed out the Kursk salient that Kyiv holds. But the Ukrainians are every bit as tough in the defense as the Russians have been. So, I mean, I think this is just part of the back and forth. We shouldn't be surprised that the Ukrainians, who have demonstrated themselves able to pull rabbits out of the hat, were able to not only launch the Kursk offensive in the first place, but have now found a way of, again, further expanding this.
Well, and Mark, you touched there on Russia's own offensive in eastern Ukraine. Tell us a little bit more about that. What sense do you get of how far Russia is able to go there, how much more determined they are to consolidate and increase any gains they have?
Well, they're certainly determined, because at the moment they are throwing very large amounts of men and material into this battle in an unsustainable way. I mean, very broadly speaking, they are essentially losing 2 soldiers, dead or wounded, for every 1 new soldier they can recruit. So in the long term, this is not sustainable. They're clearly operating, as you indicated, on the Trump timeline. That they're thinking that if Trump actually means what he says about wanting to bring some kind of a peace, or probably at best a ceasefire, to the war, they just basically want to ensure that by that stage they have pushed as far as they can. And in particular, they're trying to close in on the strategically crucial town of Kursk. And at present, they are grinding further towards it. But as I say, they're also facing very severe resistance by the Ukrainians.
And Mark, when you do mention Donald Trump there, I mean, I can't help but wonder, when you look at Vladimir Putin, is he actually ready to make a deal? Is that in itself maybe a surprise to you when you suggest there that Russians are sort of recognizing Trump coming in, that he is going to be pushing for a ceasefire? It's not something Putin would have to accept. He could push back against that, say that he's continuing this war until he finishes all of his goals.
Yeah, this is the imponderable, actually trying to sort of crawl into Putin's brain and work out what he's saying, because they're putting out very, very contradictory signals. On the one hand, Putin himself is sounding exceedingly uncompromising, setting out a series of entirely unrealistic preconditions for any kind of talks. Where at the same time, if one looks at what's being said in the Russian press, and indeed some of the sort of internal discussions that are taking place within the Russian government, it's clear that they are preparing for the potential, and I would really want to stress no more than potential, for some kind of talks. I think, look, the Russians have no more idea of what Trump is going to mean than the rest of us. So quite frankly, they are just preparing for all contingencies.
And I guess one other way to ask that, when you say, obviously, none of us know really exactly what goes through Donald Trump's mind either when he gets into office. But do you get the sense, or is there a fear, I suppose, within Russia that he could turn the other way, that if he does not get what he wants, that he arms Ukraine to the teeth, and that's what this is about?
Yes, there is a sense that part of Trump's unpredictability is also that this is a person who doesn't necessarily have the same kind of constraints as a Joe Biden, for example. And certainly in terms of the expectation management that is taking place within narratives inside Russia, it is the idea that people shouldn't assume that Trump is going to ride to the rescue and end this war. It could actually make things worse. And I think in some ways, what we're actually seeing is a concern, even frankly within the Russian elite, that Putin may just push just a bit too far. There is an awareness that Trump does not want to look as if he's being taken for a mug. He doesn't want to look as if he's being made a loser. And in that case, if he does sort of backlash against Putin, then precisely he might provide the Ukrainians with much more assistance on a much more unconstrained basis than the previous administration.
And just very quickly, Mark, because we heard at the top of the show Volodymyr Zelensky talking about U.S. security guarantees. Is there any form of those that Russia would accept?
It all depends on what the nature of the deal is and so forth. I mean, I think that we should realize that actual NATO membership is probably, a red line. In some ways, Putin has set himself up. If he accepted that, then he may well end up feeling that he's going to make himself look terribly weak. But in terms of, shall we say, NATO equivalent guarantees, as long as it just doesn't have that particular label slapped on it, probably so. I mean, again, it's very hard to say, but it's a kind of accepting point that there's no way that the Ukrainians can accept any kind of a deal unless they have serious security guarantees. And it's hard to see, just say, for example, the Europeans alone being able to provide the kind of security guarantees that would A, deter Putin, and B, reassure Zelensky.
Mark, thank you very much, as always, for joining us. That was the Russia analyst, Mark Gagliotti. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is expected to announce his resignation as early as Monday. Reports say he'll confirm the decision before a key Liberal caucus meeting on Wednesday. His departure leaves the party struggling ahead of an election due by October, with polls predicting a heavy loss to the opposition Conservatives. The U.S. Secretary of State is in South Korea as President Yoon Suk-yeol faces impeachment. Antony Blinken condemned a North Korean missile test during his visit, calling for stronger U.S., South Korean and Japanese cooperation. He also expressed confidence in Seoul's democratic process despite the political turmoil. And U.S. President Joe Biden has banned offshore drilling along most of the country's coasts. The move comes weeks before Donald Trump, who vowed to expand fossil fuel production, takes office. Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris will oversee Congress's certification of the recent presidential election on Monday, marking 4 years since the Capitol riot. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. Now, the year 2025 begins with Syria at a crossroads after the toppling of longtime authoritarian leader Bashar al-Assad. The new government is promising to change Syria for the better, and it will need the trust and help of the international community to do that. To that end, the past few days have seen the French and German foreign ministers in Damascus, and Syria's foreign minister was on his first trip abroad to Qatar, calling for an end to U.S. sanctions on his nation. Well, I'm joined now by Burcu Özçelik, Senior Research Fellow for Middle East Security at RUSI. Burcu, Happy New Year to you. Before we get to the diplomacy side of this, I just wonder what you've made of Syria's new government so far. Is it serious? Is it competent?
Thanks, Chris, and Happy New Year to you as well. Thanks for having me on. I think that there have been so far a number of encouraging steps by Syria's de facto new rulers, such as proclamations along the lines of a commitment to democratic principles, to inclusion, a guarantee that all of Syria's sects and religions, ethnic groups, will be safe and secure under the new administration, which is technically defined as a caretaker government until March of this year. Now, the plans by the current caretaker government, the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by al-Shara, includes a national dialogue conference, which is meant to be a forum to bring together representatives from across Syria's 14 governorates, inclusive of around 1,200 participants, according to reports. And this was really meant to be a springboard for a type of consensus-seeking national discussion and to set a way forward. And this was designed or reported to be planned to take place in the coming weeks, in early to mid-January. The date has yet to be confirmed, and that this has caused some concern, some anxiety among Syria's opposition groups and civil society about the intentions of the HTS government. But again, early signs are encouraging, again, promoting the idea that the new Syria going forward will be democratic and inclusive. But there have also been signs that or statements that undermine these proclamations, such as a recent interview by Ahmed al-Shara, where he indicated that it could take up to as many as 3 years for the new administration to plan to write a new constitution, and that it could take up to 4 years at the earliest to plan a national election. And they're citing various reasons for this. Of course, a very high number of Syrians have been both internally displaced and are refugees in neighboring countries. And so a sizable population of those refugees and internally displaced would have to return. There would need to be a registration, a census process before the holding of national elections. And there would, of course, have to be an infrastructure to be able to facilitate the vote. But yet, despite these technical hurdles, for a 4-year timeline for the holding of national elections just seems too much and is seen as a worrying sign, both internally within Syria's opposition and in civil society, and among regional and international actors as well, who have an interest in seeing democracy take root and stability in Syria.
Well, to that second point then, Burcu, when you look at the diplomacy that's been happening over the last few days, France and Germany's foreign ministers there, for example, I mean, what do you see as the role of the international community here in order to further along that process if they are not happy with some of the timelines you might suggest there for a restoration of democracy? I mean, does the international community have leverage here with things like sanctions? Are they going to be using that to try and push Syria to move forward a little faster?
Well, first of all, I think it's very encouraging that the foreign ministers of France and Germany, on behalf of the European Union, visited Damascus. I think it's a good indication, an awareness of how significant Syrian instability is, both for the country and its Syrian population that has suffered multiple cruelties under a 13, 14-year multi-sided civil war, in addition to the atrocities committed under the Assad regime. I think it's important for the European Union, for the United States, and for the UK to take a great interest, a policy interest in the future of Syria. And this has implications both in terms of refugee flows, in terms of counterterrorism, security, and also because of what it says about the international community and commitment to seeing Syria recover and rehabilitate after so many years of violence. And so in terms of the immediate priority, and I think there's an issue of sequencing here and maybe a mismatch between what the Syrian government hopes to achieve first, meaning economic recovery, which is contingent upon the lifting of sanctions, and what perhaps international actors are trying to push first, which is guarantees, certain concessions around the democratic future of the constitutional Syrian state. And I think this mismatch currently between what should come first, a pledge to lift sanctions, a way forward for economic recovery, versus constitutional guarantees of the various ethnic and religious sectarian groups inside Syria. I think that's the real challenge going forward at this juncture.
Well, that mismatch is really interesting, the way you describe it there. And of course, in addition to that, the conflict itself, I suppose, within Syria is not entirely over, or at least not in all of the country. There is fighting, for example, in the north between pro-Turkish and Kurdish forces. I mean, what can you tell us about that and what it signifies, I guess, about the sort of difficult road still ahead for Syria?
Well, it's a vast obstacle in terms of it's another challenge. Syria cannot be defined, unfortunately, yet as a post-conflict context because of the conflict in the north, in the northeast particularly, as well as in the southwest of Syria with the Israeli expansion of military activity in the Golan Heights. And so we have these two areas of the country, in the north and in the south, where there are ongoing disputes over the future settlement of the Syrian state, both in terms of its territorial future, any type of federal or power sharing agreement that will eventually take place during a constitutional process. So a lot is still very much up in the air. And we can't underestimate how immense the challenges are with respect to what must be achieved in Syria. And that's why, whilst this must be a Syrian-led process, and the Syrian peoples must be the ones to ultimately authorize or not the legitimacy of the HTS administration, it's imperative that international actors play a proactive and constructive role in seeing Syrians through this very difficult transition process. But the HTS, it should be noted, still does not have complete territorial control over the entirety of the country. This is true, as you've said, in the northeast of Syria, where Kurdish fighters and Turkish-backed Syrian National Army troops are sort of battling it out still in terms of progressing east of the Euphrates River. And again, there are tensions or uncertainties in the south as well with what Israel's intentions are. And there have been various groups in the country, the Kurds, as we know, of course, the Kurdish groups in the northeast, as well as members of the Druze community who have suggested that it would simply is unthinkable to lay down arms, as has been requested by the HTS Ministry of Defense, until there are certain constitutional guarantees that safeguard their rights in the new Syria to come.
Berju Özçelik of RUSI, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak, and it's time now for a roundup of business news. For that, I am joined by Isabel Hamilton, senior reporter at The Daily Upside. Isabel, Happy New Year to you. We're going to start with China and a deal for smartphones.
Yes, so this was some news that came out just before the weekend that China has this program which lets its citizens trade in normally large appliances for a discount, things like cars, ovens, big things. They're now going to expand that program so that people can trade in their phones, their tablets, their smartwatches for a discount. And, there's not many governments out there that are trying to encourage buying smartphones. But for China, this is really part of them trying to give their consumer economy a shot in the arm.
Well, to exactly that point, tell us a little bit more about that. How desperate, I suppose, are they to give their consumer economy a shot in the arm, also with things like Donald Trump coming into office?
Yeah, pretty desperate. I mean, even before Trump has assumed office, we're already seeing a weakening in China's role as an export economy. So they're really turning to their domestic economy. And even though the Chinese consumer at the moment is pretty timorous, there are specific industries where they're doing really well. And one of those is electric vehicles, which is a heavily state subsidized business. So applying that logic to smartphones, where there's already some evidence that Chinese consumers are turning more to domestic brands, makes a lot of sense.
Well, and Isabel, let's turn to one other story you have, and it is incredible, frankly, how every story, it feels like at the moment, has a certain undertone of either Donald Trump or Elon Musk to it. And your second story is about Amazon that's trying to launch a satellite internet service in the UK that would rival Musk's own.
Yes, so Amazon has this thing called Project Kuiper. It is essentially the same as Starlink, which is SpaceX's satellite internet constellation business. And there were reports this weekend that Kuiper is pushing ahead with trying to get a license to operate in the UK. Kuiper is way behind Starlink, we should say, operationally. They haven't actually got any satellites in orbit yet. Starlink has, I think, over 6,700. But the idea is that Kuiper's meant to start launching them early this year. That's already pretty delayed. They were meant to start launching them earlier. But it seems like they're trying to really get the engine moving now. And they want to start offering broadband as early as, sort of the third quarter, maybe the fourth this year.
And they're also looking for potentially Ministry of Defense contracts. I mean, perhaps walk us through that process, because this is also one of those questions of where it's something that Starlink currently has. And Elon Musk has certainly been he's been quite critical of the British government over the last few weeks. Is this something that Amazon is hoping to leverage?
Well, if I were Amazon, I certainly would want to leverage it, because these businesses, satellite businesses, it's just very demonstrable that they're very sort of suited for defense contracts. Starlink has them with the US government. It's provided coverage in Ukraine. That's kind of shown its importance as a defense tech kind of offering, right? And we now have this situation where probably the biggest satellite internet company is run by a man who is now incredibly politicized and picking fights with specific governments. So if I'm Amazon, I'm thinking, well, there's probably a bit of room for maneuver there.
And just to follow quickly on that, I mean, is there any sense when it comes to a Ministry of Defense contract that they would take heed of something like that? I mean, sure, it'd be Amazon's interest, but I mean, in terms of the process, does politics ever enter into it?
Well, geopolitics has to enter into it. I think that, the reliability of a contract and the sort of vested interests have to play into it. They're a risk.
Well, let's move on to one other story you have for us, because in the US, I should start with Londoners are very familiar here in London with a congestion charge, but the US is getting its first own version of that in New York.
Yes, so New York City has, as of I think midnight on Sunday, implemented a $9 a day congestion charge. This is actually down from the original proposal, which was $15. $9, I think that's about £7, a bit more now. And yeah, it's been met with a huge amount of resistance. I think about 10 lawsuits have been filed. President Trump himself has said he's going to step in and try and get it nixed. But this has actually been in the works for a few years. It got delayed. And the idea is for it to try and ease the congestion in New York. By some studies metrics, it's the most congested city in the world. And also, it's expected to generate about $900 million per year for their transport authority, the MTA.
And I mean, just finally on that, I mean, when they look at doing this, when they look at London, I suppose, as the first city that was really doing this properly, I mean, did they get a sense that it worked?
In London, I think long term, it probably, it didn't work. Congestion ticked down at first, but it's been ticking back up. And now I saw a report this morning that we're the most congested city in Europe. That said, other cities have brought in congestion charges and they have worked long term. I think Singapore and Stockholm have seen long-term reduction in their congestion since they brought theirs in.
Isabel, thank you very much for joining us today. That was Isabel Hamilton of The Daily Upside. This is The Briefing. And finally on today's show, last night marked the Golden Globe Awards ceremony in Los Angeles. And if there's one country that is celebrating the results more than most, it might be Brazil, where Fernanda Torres was a surprise winner for Best Actress in a Drama for the film I'm Still Here. She is the first Brazilian to win a Golden Globe and only the second to be nominated for Best Actress after her own mother 26 years ago. Well, I'm joined now from Sao Paulo by Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Faye, Happy New Year to you. You're still actually on vacation, but you just could not resist celebrating this news.
I could not resist. You know what, Chris? I love to work, especially when Brazil does well in award ceremonies. I mean, yesterday was over midnight here in São Paulo. I don't know, I was so emotional. I was actually recording myself at that moment. My mother was kind of fast asleep, and I was like, Mom, she won. It felt like a World Cup final, and I'm not exaggerating. There was even in São Paulo, people were shouting from the skyscrapers. It's a really big deal here, I have to say.
When you wrote us about this, Faye, to do this bit, you compared it to the World Cup. I mean, does that in itself that's quite a statement for a country like Brazil.
And I think it's quite beautiful, Chris, because, it's about Brazilian culture being represented outside Brazil. We're a very strong internal market. Of course, sometimes there's an artist, that does well outside. But I think I'm Still Here is doing something phenomenal. It's not only a big hit in the country, it is already the biggest hit post-pandemic of Brazilian cinema. Over 3 million people have been to the cinema. And to be honest, after the Golden Globes, much more as well. So it's a very special moment because I think the success of this film represents kind of optimism for our cinema industry in general. And Brazilians also, I must add, we have a very close relationship with Fernanda Torres and her mother, who was indeed nominated 26 years ago for a film directed by the same director, Walter Salles. We grew up watching them, both of them on telenovelas, so they are definitely household names. Every single Brazilian knows the mother and the daughter. It's a very, very special moment.
Well, to that point, Fernando, Torres dedicated the award to her mother, and here's a little clip of her acceptance speech.
She was here 25 years ago. And this is like a proof that art can endure through life, even in difficult moments. This is a film that helps us to think how to survive in tough times like this.
Fernando, to that point, this film, as you describe, is very popular in Brazil. It's also quite an emotional one, taking place during Brazil's military dictatorship. Just tell us more about the film.
Yes, it's very current. I even have teary-eyes at the moment because, yes, the film is set in the 70s where Brazil was under a military dictatorship. It tells the story of Eunice Paiva, an activist who suddenly, her husband, disappeared during the military dictatorship. Nobody knows what happened, and to be honest, it took decades to find out what happened. So it's a very touching moment. And when I interviewed Fernanda Torres in London, a few weeks ago, our interview will be out very soon, she told me that, Fernando, to do this film, it felt very current because, as we know with the news of our former president, Jair Bolsonaro, that there was a plan of a coup d'etat in Brazil back in 2022. There's still lots of investigation about it. So although the film tells the story of the 70s, of a very dark period of Brazilian history, in a weird way, it's still current. And I think a lot of Brazilians are connecting with that. So there is the success of this film, but also some backlash from the far right. But I have to say, the majority of Brazilians are very much enjoying this beautiful film.
And just finally, Fernanda, I mean, Torres, this victory at the Golden Globes was something of a surprise. She was up against a number of powerhouse actors, Nicole Kidman, Tilda Swinton, Angelina Jolie. Does this now give Brazilians hope for the Oscars?
I think it does. And I'm a very optimistic person. But you're right. Look, I mean, she was with Nicole Kidman, with Angelina Jolie, with Tilda Swinton, Kate Winslet, Pamela Anderson. So amazing actresses. And I got to be honest, Brazil, the film was nominated for the best film in a non-English language, and it lost to Emilia Paris, which another great film by Netflix. So after that, I was like, okay, the chances are hard for her to get Best Actress after losing that award. But I was wrong. So I have hopes that she'll be nominated for an Oscar. But one thing also about Fernanda, she's been very humble because there are crazy expectations here in the country about the film. So she said, listen, guys, I've opened the champagne already just to be nominated. It's not usual, to win the Golden Globe if you're in a non-English language. And it's not just Brazil or Portuguese. I think she's the fourth actress who won this award from a film that is in known English. So it's very rare. So it's a very, very special moment, but she's very humble. Just look at her speech. I think she's representing Brazil very well. And Chris, that I love a good Brazilian soft power, right?
Absolutely do, Fernando. And we'll let you get back to celebrating over there and enjoying your vacation. That was Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco. And the interview with Torres will be airing soon as well. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Laura Kramer. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and Maisie Ringer. And our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.